Hi, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1060th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege today of being your MC for a conversation featuring Heidi Zuckerman, Courtenay Finn, George Adams, and Hearne Pardee. And now it's my joy to introduce our guests and host for today. Heidi Zuckerman is the globally recognized visionary leader in contemporary art and the first woman in the US to build two art museums. She is CEO and director of Orange County Museum of Art. Formerly, she was CEO and director of the Aspen Museum of Art of the Aspen Museum for 14 years. Zuckerman has curated over 200 exhibitions, as well as founded and hosts a podcast called About Art. Courtenay Finn is the chief curator at the Orange County Museum of Art and one half of Frank, a small publishing imprint for artist projects. Recent exhibitions include Alice Neal, Feels Like Home, and Tony Lewis, Casual Tea. Prior to her appointment at the Orange County Museum of Art, she held curatorial positions at MoCA Cleveland, Aspen Art Museum, and Art in General. George Adams began his gallery career in 1978. He's been the owner of the George Adams Gallery in New York since 1995 and has represented Joan Brown since 1980. Adams attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, the College of Fine Arts, Carnegie Mellon University, and earned his BA in art history from Sarah Lawrence College. And our host today, artist and writer Hearne Pardee, is based in New York and California. His paintings and collages explore everyday landscapes. His most recent show, entitled Just Looking, was at Bowery Gallery in 2023 here in New York. Pardee is a professor emeritus at UC Davis, and we're so lucky to have him as a contributor here at the Rail. Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation today. And Hearne, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Chloe and Eleanor for organizing all this. And also, of course, to my panelists. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I also want to acknowledge the work of Janet Bishop and Nancy Lim at the San Francisco Museum of Contemporary Art, who put together the original Joan Brown retrospective back in 2022, I believe. I'm going to hope today that we just share our appreciation of Joan Brown's work. We'll be looking at a lot of work going by, and I think we want to give some sense of the trajectory of her life career, which was very complicated in some sense, but also has a through line based in San Francisco, and in her love of painting and in her devotion to herself in the broadest sense of that. I'm going to give a brief overview of that for people who may not be that familiar with her life, but I'll start with, if you can start the installation photos, Eleanor, we can get right into the images. And the exhibition is a stunning presentation of her work at the Orange County Museum in a beautiful space. And this just gives some sense of the works, which we can look at more individually later on. The exhibition breaks into four general sections. That first one was the early career, where she had a very precocious start as a student at the California College of Art. And she gained national prominence very quickly. Subsequently, she shifted dramatically and assumed a more disciplined approach, which you see here in her moved by this time it was her third marriage to Gordon Cook, an artist who took her to the Sacramento Delta, where she absorbed the influence of Henri Rousseau and took on more symbolic and allegorical work. This draws on some of the earlier connections she made, I should have mentioned, with the early work that she was married for a while to Manuel Neri, the sculptor whom she met as a student, and was friends with Jay DeFeo and Bruce Conner and the whole group of the sort of classic era of the Bay Area artists and poets who at that time sort of shared a connection with New York, I think, that merged abstract expressionism and the figurative art that was done at the Bay Area. This is the third phase of her work, where she goes back to San Francisco and indulges her great interest in swimming and dancing. She has a very lively social life there. Also gets involved with a swimming coach who she wants to get better at swimming, and gets involved with Charlie Sava, Olympic level swimming coach, who really shapes her up and very disciplined. And she imports that into her sense of the body and the more dynamic qualities in her painting. Also, there is a sense emerging of life and death, where she has a near death experience in the bay swimming on the Alcatraz swimming event. But out of that emerges a sense of more allegorical and symbolic tendency that her work has followed through along. And as we get to the final section, we find her under the influence of a fourth husband, who introduces her to Buddhism and to the influence of the guru Sai Baba, who they travel to India a number of times. She travels all over the world, and her work here begins to reflect her interest in world religions and the overall, the self, as I said, in the largest sense. With that, I'd like to, let the other people talk a little bit. And I'd like to ask everybody to comment, just given how much work Joan did. Her life ended tragically very early in 1991 when she was killed installing an obelisk that she had created for Sai Baba in India. And a parapet fell and killed her and an assistant. So nonetheless, she produced an incredible number of paintings, of which we see a selection here. And I'd just like each of the participants to say a little about how the exhibition shapes an image of Joan. What image do you see coming out of here, which is actually a selection from the selection that was much larger in San Francisco. And, with the overall context of Joan's work, and then relating her, hopefully, to the contemporary context as well. So I don't know, Heidi, did you want to start?
Sure. Thank you. And glad to see so many names and faces of people that I know on the call this morning, and really honored to have the opportunity to participate. So I also want to reemphasize the incredible curatorial work that was done at SF MoMA and the celebration of Joan Brown, who I think is a really iconic and idiosyncratic and unique artist. And Janet Bishop was here at the opening and gave just one of the best exhibition walkthroughs I've heard in a long time. She really emphasized the character that Joan was, and was able to tell incredible stories about her life and her practice, and weaving the two together. So one of the things that I would maybe emphasize after the introduction, and I always think it's interesting to talk about the influence that husbands had on the women or the artists, and I would just kind of like invert that a little bit. And one of my favorite things about the show, and one of the things that I think comes up in the show, is the transitory nature of her relationship with these different men. And I love, we own a painting here at the Orange County Museum of Art where there's a woman standing arm in arm in front of a work filled with Egyptian hieroglyphics, and she's detailed mostly, but then the male figure is just outlined. And there are quite a few paintings in the exhibition where the male figure is just kind of outlined. And I love this idea that, that Joan Brown was the heroine. She was the champion of her own story, and the main character, and that she was so generous in showing her interests and her enthusiasms and her passions throughout her paintings. And I feel like that's what really comes through in this exhibition and the selection of works that we have. It's all about Joan, and I love that you can find her in all of the works with her blue eyes and her blue eyeshadow. So she's a hero, and I think that's the story that we tell here.
Courtenay, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, sort of echoing what Heidi said. I think the show is edited down, and the way that the Orange County Museums of Art's galleries flow, the show goes in a chronological order. And as you said, it's in these 4 parts. But I think what Heidi articulates and what I think you can feel in the exhibition is how much she's producing her own narrative of her own life. She's both the star, but also the subject. And she's so earnest in celebrating the things that bring her joy, whether it's ballroom dancing or swimming, or her relationship with her son, or her pets and her relationship to animals. And I think you sort of see her in this direct, unmediated, like peer-to-peer address with the audience. Like you're on the same page, like walking almost arm in arm through the show with Joan. And I think it's so exciting to think about how the everyday can become this sort of extraordinary journey that someone else can take you on, just somebody's everyday activities in life. And she really goes to show you a lot about what the wildness of occupying a body and living a life.
All right, George, how about your ideas? Did you knew her personally, so do you have any?
Well, the story that I always tell people who don't know Joan is I start with the word fearless. For someone in the late 50s to get married and divorced, coming from a Catholic family, only child, very conservative upbringing, goes to art school, gets married, gets divorced. It gets involved with Manuel Neri, who's the older man, a Korean vet, is pregnant with Noel. They get married. She leaves him. She leaves her gallery. Joan, throughout her life, did whatever she wanted, in effect, regardless of the so-called consequences. She was not afraid. So she changed her style. She took up swimming. She nearly drowned. She finishes the race. And a story that maybe many people don't know is it continued through her career. So in about 1987, the phone rang at the gallery, and it was Joan, the sing-song voice, which I can still hear. Hi, George. Hi, Joan. How are you? Just want to let you know I'm leaving my galleries. And you can imagine my heart drops. Right? So 1987, she's decided that she's going to make a career change, focus more on public art, and she's going to leave her galleries. And I'm like, what? She's, oh, not you and Alan. I like you guys. But she left 3 galleries. Just boom, like that. And changed her whole trajectory yet again. I mean, she was amazing. So I think the exhibition shows that. And that's just fascinating. And for a role model, she's the one.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of artists today.
Yeah, that's great. I'm trying to figure out how we should best manage this. When I see paintings go by, I always think, oh, I could say something about that. And I'm sure everybody has particular associations and ideas. I've thrown in some extra images here from, this is Jay DeFeo, of course, The Rose, her famous painting, which kind of exemplifies that spirit of excess in San Francisco. And the materiality which Joan's painting certainly shared. She had paintings that fell off the canvas because they were too heavy. And the painting that comes up is a crucial one for Joan because it marked transition. It's when she decided the maximalism was going to go back to being minimal, and she was talking to Gordon Cook, who turned her on to Morandi, among other people. And so taking this material quality, which was so present in her earlier work, she refines that and begins to use different kinds of paint. We could talk about any of these. Does anyone want to?
So one of the things that I think is interesting and is a through line through the exhibition is exactly what George was saying in terms of the courage of not just the person and the life, but also the artistic practice, and to step away from works like this, which are very much in keeping with Elmer Bischoff and any of the artists that are making work at this time and in this location. You know, this work in particular is interesting because you see these broad monochromatic planes of color, and that's one of the things that I think comes to characterize what I think of as her signature style. So it's about herself and the protagonist being emphasized in the paintings. And some of the most interesting things are the flatness of her application of paint, the real I think intentional reductivist color, but also application. And so it is it is about the figure in space, and that becomes both an aesthetic choice, but also a sort of spiritual and metaphysical choice, which is a precursor of the later work where the subject matter also is about that exploration.
Right. Yeah, this is the new version of Joan as she gets married, and this is her with her husband going to the opera, I think, in San Francisco. And of course, she includes a separate panel for her dog, who's Bob, I think. Is that still?
No, that's Rufus.
That's
Rufus.
That's Rufus.
Sorry, I can't keep track. But he's sort of there like the donor in a Renaissance triptych, you know, he's presiding from the side in his own panel. And he,
sorry, Hearne, this is a wedding portrait.
Yeah.
This is,
I love
yeah,
that you can see the English sycamore trees. There's so many parts of the relationship that she had to the Bay Area and to the landscape of San Francisco and the larger Bay that really connect in the paintings. And I think to your point, like, I love that the clouds are heart-shaped. Like, she was so earnest in her kind of love of love and like finding her way and her relationships with both people and pets. So it's also lovely that Rufus gets his own panel painting. Like, he's equally as important as this relationship between these two people.
Yeah, this another very important painting. We can hold up on these if people want to say more. Just tell Eleanor to keep it there. I mean, this one has a great deal of iconography in it. I guess she's moving, you know, from the early paintings, you see more of the abstract expressionist material emphasis, but then it becomes much more the symbolism and the choice of imagery becomes much more significant.
I was curious here, George, maybe you can shed some light on this, but I love the relationship that you see play out throughout her whole oeuvre of the cat and the rat as the sort of back and forth stand in for her and her life, what she's going through, but also this relationship between the two animals. And I love in particular in this one that the rat is on the leash. And I was curious if she talked more about that, just knowing you knew her personally.
You know, it's funny, she did not talk about any of the early work with me. And I actually didn't know of, say, The Woman with Fish, the family portrait that's at the counter. I didn't know those paintings until I went out to the warehouse to pick the memorial show. And I discovered these big house paint masonite panels. And it was, to me, it was such a loss, because to me, that's where Joan starts as an artist. Like, that's who Joan is. Before that, she's still a student. She's a student of Bischoff or Park or Morangi. But it's at this point she becomes Joan. But I mean, there were so many conversations that I now wish I could have had, you know, where I would have said, what's a rat, Joan? You know, so many people have so many different theories. We're going to come to the painting that's at the canter, and I do want to talk about that because that's so loaded. But each of these paintings are they're just so full of you know, her personal iconography, fears and loves, and anyway.
If we can go back just 1 second.
Yeah, go back. You don't have to do Joan Jonas yet, but that's
Okay. So one of the things that I particularly love about our exhibition is that in the first gallery, we have the sculpture from the Berkeley Art Museum, which is this weird, creepy, like fur creature that looks like, you know, more of a beaver to me, maybe, or like a fox or whatnot. But, you know, because it's in the same collection as this painting, and because there's the rat in this, and the rat comes up again towards the end of the exhibition and works in painting on the obelisk that's included. Maybe it is a rat, but there's something really beautiful about also her sculpture, and that's maybe something that we'll talk about, but it's sort of a surprise for a lot of people in the exhibition is, if they know Joan's work, then they know her as a painter, but she made these like whimsical, hilarious, funny, strange sculptures as well. And you can see the relationship between her intention with the furry creature that's in the first gallery, and then the rat here.
Eleanor, could you go back to that? I think it's number 10. If you could.
And there it is. Yeah.
No, wait, not that one. The one before.
Next one. Next one.
Next one.
11, yeah.
11. Sorry, I got screwed up with the numbers.
Yeah, we could do a poll to think about, what everyone thinks that this creature is. But, I just, I love that it has some paint on its tail. It's, wrapped in tape. It seems like maybe it, has some better days, but, it keeps moving. And so I think that some of these animals that show up in the work, certainly the cat, are some sort of alter ego, for Joan as well.
Yeah, this is not like a cuddly sort of animal you would, go to bed with or anything. It's got lots of sharp stuff in it, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it also has blue eyes, which is nice because, of course, that's how Joan shows herself.
Right.
Okay, well, we could keep moving along then. Yeah, I threw in some Joan Jonas things just because she's very much in my mind right now, having seen the show in New York. And I think there's a connection, even though they're totally different media. I think if Joan had a video camera, she might have done things like Joan did, certainly with the influence of animals and this expansive sense of identity and interest in mythology and world culture and the natural world. So people can talk about it or not. I just thought it would be good to expand Joan's reach from the Bay Area, where it becomes very kind of cloistered, to show that there's this much larger. I mean, she was really trying to be a world artist, and I think she gets to that in a certain way. I don't know if we can talk about that more, perhaps.
I think they're both doing this sort of subconscious exploration of the world. I mean, it's not a pairing I would have naturally thought of on my own, but it is interesting. They're both exploring relationships of the body, animal mythology. They're both like starring in their own making at a time in which like the female body putting itself in front and center larger than life was not necessarily typical or what people were necessarily interested or gravitating towards. So they're both pioneers in that sense too.
Okay. All right. Is this the one you were looking for, George, or is this?
No, I actually don't see it on your checklist. It's the one at the canter. But I would say that the fish, the one at the canter, and maybe some of you do know the painting. It's called Family Portrait, and there's a cat, a female figure is a cat, there's a big teddy bear figure, and then there's a fish on the floor. And
I don't think I have that one in there.
You don't have it. I'm sorry, I should have asked you to put it in.
Yeah.
Because it's one of the most revealing to me anyway. It's the same time as this painting. But the cat is her mother. And the teddy bear is her father, and the fish on the floor out of water is Joan, gasping for breath. So whenever I see the fish, I think that's Joan. So that's why she's in bed,
In this one, I think it's great too, because if you look really carefully, the paint on the paintbrush is the same color palette as the fish. So sort of like echoing what you just said about producing yourself or coming into your own being. She's self-referencing that she's painted the fish. So like she's coming into her own as her artist. And I love her artist persona covered in clothes. And you know, Heidi mentioned earlier her eyeshadow and her eyes. She changes hair color, styles. She dresses differently, but that remains persistent.
I love that. The beauty mark shifting from floor side to side.
Yeah.
That went very fast. If anybody wanted to talk more about the woman with a mask, we could.
One of the things that I am drawn to in the paintings is the way that she paints the floors and the flooring, the tiles, the wood, the carpets. It's, you know, one of the areas in often a painting with a very reduced palette, where she includes texture and color and form, and there's also like a spatial disorientation that happens. You know, she's obviously a super accomplished painter, and I think some of the naivete of the way that she is representing her subjects is emphasized in the floors. So they often seem like they're at an angle that would be impossible for the figures to stand on. Yeah, George, you got excited about that.
I was reading up on some quotes of Joan's, and one thing she admits to is she was terrible at perspective. Whenever you see that floor and it's not quite right, that's just because she couldn't do it. But anyway, I love it. I mean, I think that's a great point.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite parts of the paintings, and I think when I look at them, originally I'm very focused on the figure, and then the longer I look, one of the things that I keep coming back to is the flooring and the, you know, the details.
Yeah.
Particularly love tiles. I don't know if we have any of the images when she's in the shower, but there's an amazing painting in the exhibition where she's sort of like fully clothed in a robe and like a shower cap, and you know, she's got a pet with her, and the tiles come up, you know, almost 3/4 of the painting.
Oh, this is another one with the floor. And strange, this one I was thinking a little bit in terms of Joan Jonas and her mirror check performances, where she takes a mirror and you can't see but she's looking at her body through the mirror, and we're watching her examine herself. And here Joan throws in this sort of cinematic thing, sort of film noir, with this strange dark street with a car outside her window, which looks very threatening.
I love, though, you can also see the attention to like the personal adornment. So she's very particular about like the shoes or some of the accessories. Like she's really thinking about a simple gesture that really carries a lot of meaning. And I think I love that too, in addition to the sort of pattern as like a repetitive memory. It like places you and gives you a sense of foundation, like you're there with her. But I love like just the tassels on the towel around her head, and then the choice of the style and color of the shoes.
And is she nervously smoking or casually smoking?
I found a great letter that she wrote to Alan in probably 78, I think, where she says, after 23 years, I've finally given, no, more than that. I've finally given up smoking, this time for real.
That's great. Yeah, this is also influenced by Francis Bacon. I think she liked she once called him the greatest painter of the 20th century. And she doesn't share his application of paint, but she's definitely focused on that isolated figure. Existential, sort of.
So I love how she's a student of art and culture as well. And I love when other works of art enter into her paintings. So my favorite is when, and we have a lot in the exhibition, where she includes paintings of her paintings, and often they're not installed. Often they're kind of they're on the floor leaning against a wall, or they become kind of a background. And certainly all of the paintings that she made that are included in our exhibition that address the challenging swim from Alcatraz. But I love this here, where again, it's the primarily monochromatic painting. There's the kind of odd use of perspective. There is the the figure who's, you know, smoking, and you don't know if it is the artist, but it probably is. And, you know, here again, she's a student of art and culture.
And it kind of brings you into her mind as you're seeing her visual experience. She's sharing her screen in a way as she's putting this in. And there, another Joan showed us. I saw this one. I said, oh, well, there's the same idea. This sort of displacement of the image, you know, so that the Joan always draws, but the drawing becomes something else, and you can, you know, the drawing isn't the thing to look at, but it's part of the whole performance. So
yeah, I think even the next painting that's in the show, yeah, this one where you really see like everything going on in her head, and it's kind of amazing. We just brought a painting into the collection last year, a Claire Rollhouse painting that also has this sort of like swirling set of different references, which is another really interesting, if you think, relationship between Bay Area painters. But I just love this one because of the way it just shows the symbolism and the references, and you see like the teddy bear that appears before, and even the bride before the cat mask goes on, the fish from that Crystal Bridges red background. It's just, you can see that all of these things are forming a vocabulary or a language that she's using to create or to speak and share outward.
yeah, there's a red shoe on top of her head.
Yeah. And Bob the dog down there in the lower corner. What I find amazing about her is that she will be so direct. A painting like this, which is clearly looking in the mirror, she's looking straight at you. And then, you know, a contemplative painting like the previous one where she's got her back to you. You know, the mood shifts.
Yeah. One of the things I love this painting. This is one of my favorite paintings in the show, for everything that everyone has said. And I also love like the bifurcation of the two colored backgrounds, how, you know, one side is gray and the other side is brown. And, you know, that kind of duality, I feel like that is something that shows up in her work a lot. And it's a duality between any of the things you could sort of fill in the blank for, you know, artist, mother, you know, wife, swimmer, you know, creator, dancer, you know, all the different kind of characters that she plays and all the different parts and pieces that make up the whole of who she is and how she's addressing all of that. And, you know, my first comment was about how she's the heroine of her own story. And I love this painting because it gives some kind of insight into like the monkey mind, right? So I'm sure we'll get to one of the paintings that I think is the most unique in our exhibition and how it deals with spirituality and how present that always is. And I think this is kind of how she starts, right? And that painting is kind of how she ends.
Yeah, I also think, to Heidi's point, the thing that's so interesting about the paintings is that they have this duality between being super in relationship with others and with a lived experience, and then also this touch of loneliness or alienation, isolation, like the struggle to figure out like who you are, where you fit, how you want to be in the world, and going back and forth between those two, because they seem so much through a lived experience connected to her life, but then you can also see her working through things. And I think that duality is something that makes the paintings really stand out for me.
Yeah, I think in one of the essays, maybe it was Karen Sujimoto, she mentioned there's an underlying melancholy to many of her portraits.
There's also the point that she talks about when things get too easy, needing to make things more difficult. And that's the transitions. And she said that the transitions were just as important. And I think that's that kind of, you know, tendency to step back, struggle, and then come out again. And if you think about the different stages of her productivity, when she came out of the Morandi phase, she did Rio Vista, she did the animals. And she had the exhibition in '68, I think it was, in San Francisco, and it got panned. She retreated again work through it, and then, 1970, bang, she's Joan Brown. It's just amazing how she's able to just keep, working through the struggles and being willing to struggle.
So I just saw a comment come up on the screen where someone said that there's a rat on her shoulder, which is true. It's on the side of the painting.
And it's the bottom.
Yeah. And one of the things that is really kind of amazing about the rat too is that the tail comes like onto her neck. So it's just, so it's like, it's not just like all of these things that are happening in her head, right? It also like permeates like her physicality as well.
Yeah, that's nice. Nice.
Isn't there a story too about how the rat came from a dream she had that terrified her as when she was younger? Or I think that's
one of her fears. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's so interesting if you think like rats persist, like the really like just all the mythologies and or stories that we tell each other or that we learn as we grow up about our relationship to animals and how it crosses narrative and mythology and culture. Like the cats have 9 lives, they're part of transformation, and then they have this sort of antagonistic relationship in terms of one trying to catch the other one. And I don't know, it really, like, you can see that sort of like looped pursuit of like working against something, like taking steps forward and then having to retreat or transition. And I feel like in some ways it's like a universal thing that people can sort of latch onto. It kind of grounds you in an experience that can be wholly your own, even though we're also sort of falling really deep into the story of one particular person living a life.
I love that, Courtenay. I just want to pick up and emphasize that idea of, what it means to live a life and what it means to record the living of a life and share that. And I think that's really very present in the work and in the exhibition.
I threw in a couple of Cindy Sherman's because in the catalog for the San Francisco show, Helen Molesworth compares her to Sidney Sherman, and I thought, well, it's worth exploring to what extent they do share anything in common, and certainly there's some similarities. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I'm tempted to disagree. I gotta say.
Yeah, well, I would say after looking at the one with all the animals in her head, I'm saying, well, this is not, this is not a Cindy Sherman kind of portrait. But go ahead and say what.
No, I guess maybe the early black and whites of Cindy's, but I just feel like Joan is she's so much more sincere on the level.
Mm-hmm.
She's revealing so much more. I don't say Cindy Sherman is revealing so much as reflecting.
Right. It's not about Cindy Sherman. It's about a facade.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with George. I think that Cindy Sherman is the object of her work, but she's not the subject.
Yeah.
And Joan is the subject of her work, and she happens to also be the object. But it's a totally different strategy and approach, I think.
Yeah.
And now I come to more. Helen Molesworth also said that she always looks different, and I'm not sure. Maybe I have trouble, recognizing faces. I know Chuck Close has that problem. I look at these and I say, well, are they different or are they the same?
I think it's both, and I think she's changing throughout all of the paintings. Her hair color, the structure of her face, like her mole flips. I think the eyes stay very present, and I think there's something almost kind of like essential, or I don't know what the word would be for it, but that follows them all, so that you see Joan in all of them, even though they look different. So they feel her, even though she's changing or trying on different personas or ways of being. You can still tell it's her. It's funny. One of the questions that was asked when the show first opened by our audience was like, why the title of this show is Joan Brown, why it didn't have a sort of subtitle or thematic. And then the audience member answered their own question, because after having seen the show, they were like, oh, because it's all about her. It doesn't need another title, which I thought was kind of an amazing revealing of its own. So
Good. So one thing I'd add to that is that I think it depends on her intention in making the painting. There was a tradition, a kind of informal tradition in the gallery where the artist would make birthday portraits. And this is true East Coast and West Coast. Bob Arneson and Joan on the West Coast in particular. And so I think there are times where she's really examining herself, and certainly the self-portrait at age 42, for instance, there was one she did specifically for a portrait show we did, where she's really evaluating herself. That parts of a woman is also, really self-critical. And other times it's more like coming up with this more fantastical figure where she's sort of trying on a psychological Joan.
Yeah, I think the work is really radically revealing in a lot of ways. And, some of the paintings that came up already where she is posing in, her underwear and, looking at like her body. And so if there are questions of, well, who's the subject or what is this work about? The next work you come upon is it's clear that it's her and that she is offering herself as a subject, an object, and something to be considered in a way that I think is very courageous and authentic. And I think that that's part of the spirit or the ethos of her work that really comes through in the exhibition.
Yeah.
And it's really different from, someone like, Hannah Wilkie, right, who's looking at, her body like subject as the subject or like scientifically. I think it's much more about like her soul and trying to capture like the essence of kind of what Courtenay says, like living a life or the essence of being human or being alive.
Yeah.
Well, if we could go back to that one for a minute, it would be good to introduce her swimming coach here. This is a very different, George, we're talking about the purpose of the painting. Well, this one is clearly about affirming her allegiance to Charlie Sava, the swim coach who transformed her swimming, at least, and I think some of her paintings too.
I definitely think the painting, she talks about swimming as like a pursuit of progress and how much she learned about her practice, her artistic practice from Charlie, just thinking about like efficient forms for maximum effect. Like you can see that as a swimmer, like as a technique, but then you can think about it in relationship to her paintings where the simplest line is producing, an entire environment that you come into immediately without her having to build it, in a theatrical way.
So just to add, I don't think they're in the show, but she also did a full length, and it's, I think, 84 or 90 inches tall portrait of Charlie Sava in that same white shirt. It's monumental, and it's just kind of like, Charlie Sava, And then she did one of the greatest paintings ever, which is Charlie Sava with friends Rembrandt and Goya. I mean, this is like, how hysterical is that? But it's just telling her that's her pantheon, at that moment. It's just great.
There's incredible emotional honesty that she says, well, he's up there with them. And
yeah, that's right. It's so it's just, I don't know, it's so earnest.
I think in that earnestness too, there's something that also comes across about the role of learning and the role of teaching. She was such a passionate teacher and also a lifelong learner. And you can see it in her practice. Like she's going back again and again to other painters' art history, but also employing things that she's learning from people in her life and then seeing how they fit into her practice. And so I love that idea of like Charlie Salvat, Rembrandt, Goya, like all these people are the people that one learns from, and they're equal for Joan.
I was going to include that painting, but it's so difficult to see. The faces are so dark. And then even darker, there's Joan herself, apparently, according to Janet Bishop, is in the background with her arm up in triumph. Behind. Yeah, if you look closely, you can see that. I don't know.
Oh my God. Oh, that's funny. Thank you, Janet.
But this one is amazing, just the way she gets the ripples in the water. But talking about, economy and the way she's paying attention to the way she, makes marks now compared to the early work where it was this spontaneous expressionistic stuff. The background is like a frieze of Greek figures or something, of athletes, I guess, very disciplined.
Yeah, I love the swim lines and how it comes, right into her bathing cap. And then, that she paints the goggles, and then underneath the goggles, again, you see the blue eyes, so like that kind of consistency of representation.
I know. It's one of her best paintings, I think. And then I guess streamlining the figure, she gets into these sculptural forms that are very simplified.
Well, so this is, oh, go ahead, Courtney.
No, you go.
So this was part of what I was referencing earlier when I was talking about the inclusion of the sculptures in the exhibition and how they are made of these kind of, banal everyday forms, and that they, through the material, elevate the everyday to something more grand. So similar to the subject matter, which seems like everyday and banal, it gets elevated as well. And so my favorite part of this is that above the water, the swimmers are painted, and below the water, it's just the pure material.
Yeah, I think it's so great. And the way that this piece is installed in the show here is it's in this sort of center of the gallery between two paintings that both show Alcatraz. So also talking about the distance of swimming, the like lifelong pursuit, that practice. And it is, again, that sort of binary that you see often, which is like the personal adornment or the things that you present on the outer world, and then the elemental sort of nature of us all, like we're all connected.
The one thing I'll add about these sculptures, my understanding is that there was a leak in the roof of the barn in Rio Vista, so she couldn't paint. So she made these cardboard sculptures on the kitchen floor. I mean, it's just so great, So she's making cardboard sculptures, detritus sculptures, when she's with Manuel in 61, 62. And then here she is 10 years later going, I can do that again. And it's completely different. The smoker, the dancers on the car. I mean, they're great. They're just wonderful.
Oh, this is another one I love. Speaking of going back to Heidi's comment about the attention to the built environment or the pattern of the floor. And for me, her use of pattern is so interesting, and you can see her almost disappear into it as she goes forward in her paintings and in her life. And I love this like awkward leg, like entering or exiting, like making space, like around the time that she's suing the Dolphin Club, so to allow women to be able to participate. And then you see the sort of window / also other painting that kind of places you in the Bay Area.
Yeah, this is titled The Weight Room at the Dolphin Club, I think. So it's the place where they would work out.
Whatever, excuse me, the shoe is in for Joan, always. Whenever you see a high heel shoe, if she collected shoes, she loved shoes. So that's, that's just like, just enough of Joan in the painting.
It's so great with the sock, with the folds.
Yeah,
like
the sock, right? Really? Great.
Eleanor, you can maybe speed up a little bit. We don't want to run out of time. So if there's but there's a lot of stories to tell too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, this one in particular, I think like really stands out for me in terms of a lot of what we're talking about, the sort of the way she's painted the wall, then the painting within a painting, but also her use of pattern and her relationship to textiles, like the ship freighter that created the waves that caused her near drowning is like now part of her dress, and then the butterflies and the things on the carpet, and she's sitting here at this sort of like very calm and still, where in the painting behind her, swimmers are like frantically being pulled out of the water as they're almost drowning. And that sort of duality again between the calm and the wildness, I think coexisting, is just so great.
I love the wire of the phone cord and how that kind of, for me, references like the sculpture where she's smoking as well. So there's this kind of ethereal gesture through space.
But also the telephone, the presence of the telephone is the spiritual connection. It's in a number of other ones, and it's a kind of near-death thing. And then on one of my last visits with her, it was in '89, right after the earthquake. And she told me a story of being in her studio at Berkeley. She said, I always leave at 5 o'clock, but the telephone rang. And I stayed on the phone for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, but if I hadn't been on the phone, I would have been on the Bay Bridge during the earthquake. And that just shook her, you know. So that whenever you see a telephone, then numbers also, she would add up numbers and come up with it, you know. So that's very significant. There's no reason for a telephone to be there, but you see it in a couple of paintings from this period, including the drawing behind me. Great painting.
I love this one too. I love, again, going back to something Heidi alluded to, which is sort of the disappearance, appearance of the figure fading out, almost always a male identified figure. And in this case, the outline, you know, the wine glass, like the mouth open, and then the fully like layered, like patterned presence of this group of folks in their bathing suits. And the shoes, I just think those white shoes with the are just so iconic of that moment in time. The show we had on view before this was an Alice Neal show, and there's a painting from around the exact same year of her son Hartley wearing those shoes too.
The things I've never understood this painting because stylistically it's such a radical departure.
Yeah.
And I remember it was one of the first paintings I ever handled of Joan's. And I loved it. I loved it immediately, but it just didn't fit in. And then still you know, it's one of those questions I really wished I'd been able to ask.
It's very funk, isn't it? It's got a more of the funk aesthetic.
It's a throwback painting. It's so
Yeah.
in so many ways.
I mean, it has more texture, so it's definitely like she's mixing different elements or moments of time and alluding to a future where the pattern goes, you know, the body is almost disappearing into the pattern, which happens later, but she hasn't gotten there yet. Almost like she's both seeing into the future and harnessing the past.
Yeah. No, it's a great painting. God.
Yeah, I think it's a super weird painting. I think it's the outlier in the exhibition also. And it makes me uncomfortable in a way that none of the other paintings in the exhibition do. So, and the way that I sort of ground myself in it is the reclining figure, the male outlined there. So I'm like, okay, I'm still okay with this painting.
Yeah.
So I threw in another Cindy Sherman just because she's doing this sort of thing too. You can just for reference. This is the other thing she loved, physical activities, but dancing was one of her favorite things.
Yeah, ballroom dancing. Yeah,
and always locating these paintings in San Francisco because of the skyline. So I think that's a really important part as well.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's so exciting and interesting to see somebody who's getting a sort of psychic energy from the place that they're making work from. And you can see it in her like use of landmarks and the mystical light that happens in the Bay. Like she really found a source of inspiration in the place and the life that she was living there. And I think I lived in the Bay for grad school. I went to CCA, and it's something that I didn't really understand until I had spent time there. So it's so nice to see it in these paintings.
So this painting's in our collection, and it is one of the the works that we started with when we opened the new building. And here you can again see the outlined reference of the male can kind of be interchanged, like husband 1, husband 2, husband 3, husband 4, right? And so I love that, and I really feel like this painting emphasizes again Joan as the lead character of her story, and as the one who's, you know, interpreting things that are familiar but yet not fully comprehensible. And what I always say in front of this work is that most people probably understand that this is Egyptian art, and probably very few people can transcribe the cartouche. So it's a really wonderful metaphor for looking at art and bringing with you to the experience what you know, and having that be enough, not needing to know everything.
So what's the date of that painting? Do you remember?
Of our painting?
Yeah.
I think it's 78. I can double check. I think it's 78. Let me double check.
So what I was thinking was that she's traveling alone in Egypt, I believe. And I mean, sometimes she makes paintings before she goes on a trip about where she's going to go. This is really hers, like without a companion. They're with and without, or maybe the dream companion. And then she meets Mike in 79.
I love that. Thank you for adding that. That's incredible.
It just struck me. I mean, it just struck me. The male disappears, and after the Modesto situation, he's gone. He vanishes. But this is a very firm outline. So, and the bell-bottom pants, gotta love it. I don't. Maybe it's David.
76. It's 1976. I was like, it's towards the
But,
end.
you know, it could be a reference to David Pugh. You know, David in Egypt, who she danced with and stuff. But that the bell-bottoms is what. Anyway, something to
But
think
I
about.
think exactly the bell bottoms, it's like these really simple references to a specific style or moment in time that really then carve out like a character, even though it's just an outline of a figure.
Yeah, no, there's personality there. Huh. Think about that.
Yeah.
This is probably my favorite painting in the whole show. So I love this painting. I love the purple. I love the boldness and the bigness and just the absorption of the paint into the space and vice versa. And I love that, again, the blue eyeshadow matches the blue burqa. I just think this painting is perfect. I think this is the most perfect painting.
That's great.
Yeah.
I
love.
will, sorry, I will
No, you
confess.
go, George.
Sorry, I will confess that this painting was in the first show that I did with Joan in I would have been fall of 80, I think, or January 81. And it was all the India paintings, and I was completely baffled. I was like, what? It's a great painting. Absolutely wonderful painting.
It's so great because you can see her body and her sense of her own body, even though it's completely obscured by the pattern. And I think that's the thing that you see the shift in, is that the body, in terms of being put forward, is disappearing into the pattern, but it's still super present. And then I love even the small details of like the white space where the tiger isn't quite filled into its own form. So it's like both in motion or coming into being. And I think that really sort of, I don't know, sets it apart from like, you can see her thinking through these things in the work.
Yeah, and this plant that looks almost like fire also. So it's not clear if it's foliage or if it's fire, and then the different like application of the paint in that kind of form, as opposed to, you know, the burqa, which is just like solid and like opaque. So there's the combination of the different applications of paint, which references back to her early style and you know how heavily impastoed they were. So she just shows like what a great painter she was as well, and you know her handling of the diversity of the paint applications.
So there's the two sides of Joan that we were talking about earlier, Heidi. It's how many? So
It's so great. And here I love too, it's like she's still covered in paint, holding the paintbrush. Like she's still like presenting herself as a painter, as an artist, but the blue is also the blue, the background of her as the cat, and same with the sun, and you have the sun and the moon, and also the framed, it's the two frames, so they exist separately but also coming together. This is one of like almost I would say like the final work that you see in the show, and it's kind of has that sort of takeaway that you've gone on this journey with her, and she's sort of arrived at a place where she feels comfortable in both of these personas at the same time.
Yeah, it's titled Harmony, so I think that's her
Yeah.
overall feeling about it.
Yep.
Do we have the red painting with the ceiling
Fan?
fan?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the last one. We have 2 or 3 to go through, but we could go through pretty quickly.
No,
and
it's okay.
This is in her studio, and you can see on the wall there the mark that was left when she completed Harmony, that blue line curving on the wall behind her. I like that she can go from these allegorical images to something that's like, well, here I am, it's just, this is it, day by day.
This painting was done for a show we did called In the Studio.
Hmm.
It was a very direct. Mike.
And there's her husband.
Yeah, these energy field paintings I think are super interesting too. Like she's also trying out a different kind of style with the way that the backgrounds are rendered, but then she eventually goes back to the sort of the flat patterning that the tiger painting sort of portrays. But this one I love because she has the inscription for Mike with love from Joan.
The one thing about that sort of energy field period in her work, which is 77, 78, is that not very long ago, I'm embarrassed to admit, I was looking at one of them and there's all this underpainting underneath. Mm-hmm. And what I discovered in the misunderstanding was there's a snake. And if you look at the Monica drawings, Monica with snakes, it's that snake. I'm still trying to figure out what was going on, but there's all this image. So at the same time as she's making those, Elmer Bischoff is doing those sort of layered paintings also of those late acrylics. And I'm trying to figure out if there was some connection.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's amazing.
This is when she's doing obelisks and shifting over to public art, as she was telling George. She's trying to get out of the painting business. And
yeah.
I think it's so interesting because I think that shift just seems to be, to me at least, like an extension of her wanting to communicate outward. And she really was trying to be in dialogue with people, both in the paintings, I think, but as she's sort of trying to reconcile her spiritual quest with her quest of just being a human, this like idea of how to connect both to the universe but to other people, and like to actually go out into public space to do it seems like I don't know, weirdly a natural progression maybe for her at that stage. And I love in this particular obelisk the rat comes back, but it's become part of the patterning, and then the cat and the rat and their relationship together.
Well, she was definitely at and I would say this is probably starting about 85 maybe, definitely more skeptical, if not disdainful, of the commercial world. And I think she really just went like, public art is where I want to be. There's none of that other kind of elitist stuff. I mean, it was really interesting, the shift.
Yeah, I think about this painting in the exhibition as sort of like the exception that proves the rule. So is the fan, of course, is spinning even though the switch is off. And Janet talked about this work as being representative of her spirituality. And, so it's something that I think you find throughout the entire exhibition. And this work is sort of like the great reveal in a certain way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think this is a really important painting.
Yeah.
well, Well, we've come about to the end of the slides here, and it's just about time for questions. So that worked out really well. Thank you, Eleanor, for timing everything.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you, Hearne. Thank you, Courtney. Thanks, Heidi. Thank you, George. This has been really, really inspiring, and what an amazing show. Thank you for your insights. We've got some questions here from the audience, and if anyone else would like to ask a question, please do send a message in the chat. And our first question today will be from GE, and I'll read it on his behalf. So GE wrote, can we say that in her overall deep consistency, Joan was saying, shall world shape us, or shall we shape ourselves in the world?
Both.
Both.
I would say both too.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our next question is from James, and James, I will allow you to unmute here.
Oh, great. You want me to talk?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering, Joan was a teacher of mine in 1989. So a great influence to me, really encouraged me to actually be a painter. But I was just wondering about her connection, if you guys had stories related to Berkeley, at that James Melchert. And then I was thinking of the Bay Area figurative tradition of David Park and Arneson and those guys, and like how humor, that kind of special California Bay Area humor, played into her work.
Yeah, I don't have a specific story, but I think that's right. I think the work is very much of a time, and I think that one of the things that's been interesting as someone who was kind of raised in the Bay Area and then, you know, lived there multiple times, I feel like the rest of the world has sort of caught up with the Bay Area, and that idea of what the sort of values of you know, humor and play and idiosyncrasy and self-definition and you know, courageous independence that you find in all of the creators that you mentioned, and in the spirit of what I would call sort of like a Bay Area ethos, is consistent within the really diverse practices, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this show here in Orange County. Is there's a relationship, and it's also so different.
Mm-hmm.
Did she say anything about humor when she was teaching?
Well, interesting. I think Mr. Adams talked about how she came into a room and she just lit up the room, and how encouraging she was and how inspiring she was. And there was always a delightful kind of atmosphere that she created, and super influential to me now as an art teacher here in Brooklyn, in New York. And I'm surprised how the Bay Area figurative tradition is not really talked about here, and should be. I do it.
So people still ask me, like, oh, you know, how does the East Coast respond to Joan Brown? It's like, well, she's been exhibiting in New York since 59, 60? I mean, you know, one thing I'll just quickly add, when I would come out, I would visit all of the artists, and I would end up staying with Joan at the end of the trip. And Joan always made a point of saying, how's Roy? And Joan was probably closest in aesthetic and sort of intent to Arneson, but Roy was a kind of kindred spirit. And that always struck me as really interesting. So just, that's something to chew on.
Thanks, James, for that question. Thank you all also for your generous responses. Our last question in the Q&A here today will be from Chloe.
Thank you all so much for this conversation, which has been such a pleasure to listen to. My question is sort of a big one, but I'm curious what each of you would say. I'm curious what you think surrealism unlocked for Joan in her work, and in what she was trying to say with her paintings. I'll stop there.
Stunned silence.
So what I would say is that I think she had a real kind of uncanny ability to represent how she knew things. And I think that there is an element of the surreal to that. So thinking of it in its most kind of big and generous way, which is, how we understand reality and how we choose to be in relationship to it. So I think that her work is filled with truly idiosyncratic representations of both images and content that is maybe informed from surrealism, but certainly with a lowercase s for sure.
Heidi, I think you nailed it. I don't think Joan even saw a barrier between realism and the real and the surreal. It all flowed together. She was so intuitive, so spiritually connected that I think it just totally natural that things could occur simultaneously in both realms.
Yeah, just to kind of pick up on that and just re-emphasize the idea of simultaneity and multiplicity. And it's one of the things that I think is really speaking to the broad audience of her work now, is this idea of the both and rather than the either or. And it was not necessarily common at the time, and we now exist in a way of embracing multiplicities. And I think that kind of embrace of the seemingly discordant or previously dichotomous is the way that we live in time. And I think that's one of the ways that her work is connecting with audiences now.
Very nice.
That's a really good question.
It's a great question. I think both of you answered it so well. I think the thing that you can really get exquisitely, I think, from the exhibition presentation too, is sort of that it becomes a pattern that doesn't necessarily at first seem like it's going to make sense, but is intersectional. So you loop around and you realize that it's made complete sense, even though everything is changing the entire time that you're making the loop. And I think that just sort of goes to show the sort of strength in her pursuit of practice and her way to communicate externally with others.
Nice.
Thank you all so much for those beautiful answers. I'm going to pass the mic back over to Eleanor.
That was a great question. Thank you, Chloe. And thanks to you all so much for responding. That will conclude our Q&A for today, but I'm really thrilled to pass it back over to Heidi for a reading.
Thank you. So we were told that Brooklyn Rail conversations always end with a poem, and we were back and forth last night about how we might want to address that, and we got excited about having a Bay Area poet. So my suggestion is Bill Berkson, and part of the reason that I chose Bill was because personally I had joined the Berkeley Art Museum right at the time of Joan's last museum retrospective. And one of my colleagues there was Connie Llewellyn. And of course, Bill and Connie had a great love story. And Joan had many great love stories. And so I thought it would be wonderful to end the conversation with Bill Berkson's poem, which is called Song for Connie. So here it goes. The sun met the moon at the corner, moon in thin air. Commotion you later chose to notice. Love shapes the heart that once was pieces. You take in hand the heart in mind. Your fate's consistent alongside mine. Unless a mess, your best guess. That is right. Thanks. The intimate fact that you elect it. at corners, dressed or naked, with lips, taste, full body, time thick or thin, fixated. Love, take heart, as heart takes shape. And recognition ceases to be obscure. One line down the center, another flying outward enters.
Perfect.
Incredible. Thank you, Heidi. That was a really, really perfect way to conclude today's NSE. It's been truly such a joy and an honor. Thank you so much, Courtney and George and Heidi and Hearne, for today. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our NSC program and make these daily conversations possible. And you can also explore our archive on the Rails YouTube channel, and this conversation will be posted there very soon. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation will directly support our writers, production staff, and operations here at the Rail, and there's a link to that in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Pacific Time for a conversation with Joyce J. Scott and Angela N. Carroll on the occasion of Walk a Mile in My Dreams, currently on view at Baltimore Museum of Art. Thank you all so much for tuning in today on this Monday. You can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
enjoyed
Heidi.
this.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you very
George.
much.
Thank you, Hearne.
Thank you.
Thank you so
That
much.
was
Thanks, Hearne.
amazing.
Thank you.
Very terrific. Thank you.
You,
Good to see everybody.
Everybody, I hope to see you soon.
Bye
Well
now.
done.
Thank you.
Go see the show if you're on the West Coast.
Yeah, it's good. Worth the
Bye,
trip.
everybody.
Bye.